Saving Private Ryan arrived in 1998 and changed the ways in which we looked at movies and the ways in which war films especially are filmed, marketed, and viewed maybe forever. Every single film afterwards, every single war movie after Saving Private Ryan kind of mimics the Saving Private Ryan look. It is a spectacular film, and it has a lot to talk about when we talk about the ways in which we think about World War II and think about how we remember World War II. Hey, everybody, this is Jason Herbert. I am the host and creator of Historians of the Movies, and every single week we're talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week we're talking about Saving Private Ryan, and we're also talking about a brand new book called Scorched Earth, A Global History of World War II. It's by Thomas Chamberlin. He is a professor at Columbia University. This is a really cool, if you're looking for a really great single volume book on World War II that really brings a fresh perspective. I just finished reading it a couple days ago before we got ready for this pod, and it's a really, really captivating, mesmerizing look at this war in a single volume. I really enjoyed it. So I invited on Paul to come in and talk about his book, but also this film, talk about that opening sequence, but also the larger messages that Saving Private Ryan is trying to tell us, not only about World War II and its immediate aftermath, but maybe also the tail end of the 20th century. So it's a really engaging conversation with a really phenomenal scholar. I really enjoyed talking to him today, and I hope you will too. So sit back and relax, because Saving Private Ryan is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. So we were just saying before we started recording, I was like, "Hey, welcome to Colorado." And I have to tell you a thing. I moved here from Florida a couple years ago, and getting used to going from East Coast time to Mountain time, where there were approximately 47 people, and that's about it. Nobody lives in Colorado. This is like a mythical place. Has been the most difficult, weirdest thing. It was so easy when I lived in Florida because everybody's on East Coast time, and now we're on a Saturday and doing stuff. So I appreciate you being here, man. This is gonna be a fun talk.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I've been wanting to talk about this film. We've been doing this pod now for about 2.5 years, and I'm shocked that nobody's taken it yet. There's usually the film I was actually just talking to my friend Mary Hicks, who teaches over at University of Chicago, did Master and Commander. And usually everybody's like, I want that movie. That movie's been requested like 7 or 8 times. And I keep waiting for somebody to snap up Saving Private Ryan. In fact, I think the first thing I recommended to you was something else. And then we were like, well, let's do Private Ryan instead. So I'm geeked to actually talk about this film because I think we're going to be able to have a lot of stuff. Before we jump into that, you want to introduce yourself to our audience here?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Paul Chamberlin. I'm a professor of history at Columbia University. And I just finished a book on World War II, Scorched Earth, Global History of World War II. And yeah, I teach classes on U.S. foreign policy. I've taught a little bit on the Arab-Israeli conflict, international history, world history, stuff like that.
All right. I have so many things to talk to you about today. As you talk about in the book, World War II is like the minefield of like people just keep going back and back and back to World War II. So I guess maybe the first question to ask you is like, why write another book about World War II? Like what was the impetus in writing this? And I've read it, guys, and it's good. But why write Scorched Earth?
So, I mean, this really emerged from my teaching. I would teach all these classes about U.S. foreign policy and 20th century international history, and in all of those classes, World War II is such an important event, and it's really I think most historians are pretty comfortable with the notion that 1945 is really a turning point across societies all over the world. So it is this key moment in world history. And a key moment in American history. But I found that a lot of my lectures and a lot of my classes just weren't very interesting. I just felt like we were dealing with a narrative of the war that was very conventional. It was very straightforward. When I talked about World War I, when I talked about the Korean War, when I talked about the Vietnam War, right, I was able to bring in all of these these conflicting readings, for the
Mm.
students, right? I've got students in a seminar, and we're talking about the origins of the Vietnam War, and I've got 5 or 6 different big interpretations of the war that are all fighting with each other, all contested, and that makes for great discussion. But I felt like it was really hard to do that for World War II, because if you're talking about World War II as this sort of global event, most of the big overarching histories are very, very conventional, and they pretty much hew to a very common story that most people are fairly familiar with. And so I just felt like it. Yeah, sometimes I would find myself almost skimming over this period so I could get to the interesting stuff in the Cold War, which as a historian is ridiculous. This is the largest, in many ways, most consequential event or conflict in 20th century history and arguably world history, and I'm treating it as the prelude to the Cold War, which is problematic. And so I wanted to kind of be part of trying to craft a revisionist narrative of the war that can speak to a classroom full of students in the 21st century, and is a war is a study that's asking new questions about the war. So that's really what I tried to do.
Paul, are you finding, as a professor, that students are coming into your class with preconceptions about World War II? What are students saying when they show up? Are you also getting the history buffs at Columbia? Who's showing up in these classes, and essentially what are they showing up thinking about or understanding about World War II before they ever enter your classroom?
So it's still incredibly popular. Whenever I teach a class on this, I have long wait lists. It's surprising, right? Because you would think that, it's such, as it recedes, deeper and deeper into history, you would think that the interest in the topic would start to ebb, but it really hasn't. I get all sorts of students, again, because the war is so relevant to so many different people around the world. And the reality of Columbia is it's a very international university, right? We have students from all over the world, and so there isn't. I don't know if there is really a common framework, like in global terms, right? Americans have their vision of what the war is, but I've got a lot of students from mainland China, right, and they have a very different idea of what the war is. I have students from Russia; they have their own story. I have lots of students from the UK; they have a very different version of World War II. At least in their memory. I have students from France, right? The French students think about World War II in very different ways than we do. So part of what I try to do in my classes is establish kind of a common base of knowledge. And one of the ways I do that is by pointing at Saving Private Ryan, right? And that's really why I kind of pushed to talk about this film, because it's kind of my shorthand for the conventional American understanding of what World War II was.
Well, man, I am so excited then, because for our listeners, then we're going to get a Columbia education on the war and this film today. And one of the things I love actually when you talk about this idea, and you talk about this in the book, right? It's a popular memory of this conflict. It's a global conflict. Therefore, you're going to have global memories, and not all of these memories are going to jive with one another. And it's probably not realistic to think that they would. So, and so much, I think, I want to get into this a little bit later on about how our modern day, our society in 2025 is shaped continually by our memories of this conflict, and which are in turn also kind of guided by pop culture in films like Saving Private Ryan and other things. My ex-wife, who actually, it's so funny, she just sent to me, a former Columbia student herself, graduate there. She's going to demand that I say that on air, just sent to me some Soviet propaganda about the war on Instagram just this morning. I don't know if that's just what Columbia students do after they get their degrees. They just sit around looking at whatever. But this was
Soviet propaganda.
I guess so. I don't even know. So we'll work that out later on. Let's talk about a few different things. One of the things that you talk about in this book is how it's this war is really. I think the conventional understanding of this war is often, hey, it's a war for empire on the part of the bad guys, right? It's Germany and Japan. And I guess we'll acknowledge Italy and all of these things. And they're out there trying to create this great empire in Europe or the Pacific and so forth. And you're arguing that that's not necessarily the case on the part, or not only the case on the part of the Allies themselves. This is a war for empire all the way around. Am I correct?
Yes, all the way around, but in very different ways,
Okay.
right? So as we approach the start of World War II, depending on where that is, you might say it's 1931, you might say 1937, you might say 1939. But as we approach that, the 1920s and 1930s are really a world of empires, right? If you're looking at international relations, um, ideas about global order and world order in the 1930s, um, they're they're largely connected to empires, right? The largest and most powerful players on the world stage are all empires, right? It's the British Empire, right, is the most expansive and largest, demographically largest empire in the world. France has an empire. France is a major power. The Soviet Union is kind of an empire in the midst of reconsolidating itself after the Bolshevik Revolution, right? Stalin is kind of gobbling up territories in Eastern Europe and trying to reconstitute the old empire of the Russian czars. China is in the midst of coming together as kind of a singular political unit that is really imperial in scope, right? Both the Soviet Union and China are these, continental size powers, right? And they're building themselves into this over the course of the 20s and 30s through different means. And of course, the United States is just a juggernaut in so many ways, right? It spans the North American continent. The United States, in economic terms, is by far the most powerful nation in the world. And the United States, even though a lot of Americans don't like to think of it this way, the United States is an empire. Officially, it is an empire. It has colonies. And the largest American colony at this point of time is the Philippines, which coincidentally is going to become a key battlefield of the Pacific War. So just from the standpoint of what the international order looks like in the years leading up to World War II, it is a world of empires. More than that, empire really is what structures the worldviews of a lot of the key architects of the Second World War. Right, people like Churchill, people like Roosevelt, they've grown up in this world of empires, and they, for better or worse, they believe that national power is often connected to imperial power. Right, the possession of overseas colonies gives you all sorts of resources. It gives you, new territories to settle excess population. It gives you access to overseas bases. Right, it's a key part of projecting power. If you're a big land empire, control of all these territories gives you tons of arable farmland. It lets you build a massive population. It lets you build up a large manufacturing base. It gives you access to natural resources. Right, so if you want to be an important player on the world stage in, say 1930, you almost have to be an empire. And this is a lesson that is not lost on the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. Right, they're looking at this world, and they're concluding, or at least the leadership of these countries is concluding, that the only way that they're going to survive in this world of empires is to become imperial powers themselves. And they feel like they're running out of time. Because, as I said, China is in the midst of a political consolidation, and this is the exact territory that Japan wants to have its essentially living space, right? Its colony. The Soviet Union is emerging from the Bolshevik Revolution, is becoming a major player on the world stage, and this is seen as a dire threat to German imperial ambitions. Right, the German leaders want to reconstitute territory to the east, and then the Italians are, Mussolini is his mind is animated by memories of the Roman Empire, and he very much wants Italy to be an imperial power like France and Britain, and he's looking at the Mediterranean, he's looking at Africa, and so just if we're thinking about the origins of the war, it's all connected back to empire, because empire is just kind of ubiquitous, right? Most of the world's population lives in an empire, either as a citizen or a subject. And it's really only after 1945 that we see an international system that is composed primarily of nation states as opposed to empires and colonies. And then, the way that the war itself is fought, um, the start of the war, in Asia and in Europe is all, based on these land grabs from, the Axis powers, right? These are imperial, it's an imperial invasion of Poland that Germany launches. It's an imperial invasion. It's a colonial land grab that, Japan is pursuing in China. And that's really what triggers the start of the war. And then once the war really kicks off, you have these, supposed kind of colonial territories that become the sites of most of the battlefields, right? The key battles of the Pacific War are all in, Europe and in Western colonies, for the most part. And most of the fighting that takes place in Europe takes place in Eastern Europe, which is a territory that both Stalin and Hitler see as potential imperial territories. And then finally, and I'll stop rambling here, but in order to win the war, both the Soviet Union and the United States have to build themselves up into these massive, what we now call superpowers, but at the time are these gigantic imperial states that are capable of projecting force far beyond their borders. So, I mean, the war is just imperial in its origins. It's imperial in the way that it's fought, and like where it's fought, and essentially how victory is achieved by the Allies.
Yeah, it's. I read this yesterday. I was actually going back and rereading Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography, right? And he's, it's taking place, several decades before this takes place. But in this autobiography, he's talking about how he's like, we've got to build the Navy. We've got to do this. We have to have an empire. And his whole belief structures towards the end of the 19th century is like, look what's going on over here. We need to build this. So it's like you were talking about, these thought processes that say Germany and certainly Italy and Japan are thinking about are the same processes that, the Americans had just a few decades earlier. Because Roosevelt's lamenting the fact that, as I was reading the autobiography, he's like, our Navy sucks. It's not good enough. And there's all these people saying we don't need a Navy. And it's like they don't understand what's about to happen. And maybe that's a conversation for later on about maybe the inevitability of an empire, or like whether the idea of constructing an American empire is actually a defensive idea, as these people are looking around saying, this is what's coming. This is the reality of the situation, and we've got to make these land grabs. And this sounds horrible as a conversation, so I don't want to dwell on it. But it does certainly seem that everyone's looking around going, okay, it's coming down to us. It's the big boys on the block almost. I don't know what this speaks about to South America, which is another conversation I would love to have at some point in time about what happens in South America during the war, because it seems like they kind of get the discussions of South America during the war seem to get left out. And I'm always interested to see what happens there. I want to talk about Private Ryan for a minute, because you say, you really kind of use this as your primer to the war, this lingua franca, if you will, of talking about the war. Why Private Ryan? Because like you're saying, there's no shortage of films, both in the United States and elsewhere, about the conflict. And there's a lot of good ones, there's a lot of bad ones. Why Ryan? Why is this one so important to you?
Part of it is my age, right? I was born in 1979, so I was 18 when this came out.
77.
Yeah. And this was huge. This was a huge movie. I feel like it's one of these things that almost everyone has seen. Mm-hmm. Maybe not so much anymore with my students, right? Because now it's a very, very old-timey film for my students.
I don't want to admit it.
Yeah, I need to start asking them more. It's like, has anyone actually seen this movie? Or
right?
I don't know if they watch movies anymore. If they're longer than 10 seconds. Yeah, I mean, it was. It's really it's a pivotal film in terms of how Americans think about the war. It comes at a really important moment in American history, I think, and the way that I think about this is that it arrives really at the height of the unipolar moment, right? Which is this. It's kind of this decade between 1991 and 2001, right? So it's the decade between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. Mm-hmm. And this is when I'm just starting out in college. I'm in a lot of political science and history classes, and particularly, my poli-sci classes. they're kind of swimming in this sort of end of history idea, this notion that now that the Cold War is over, we've essentially figured out what the world is supposed to look like, and the world is supposed to look like, some version of the United States, and some version of, democracy plus capitalism plus, mass consumer culture. This is what everybody wants, and the United States is now finally in a position to give it to them, right? And I think this is a mindset that is very particular to the pre 9/11 world, right? 9/11, changes everything. And 98 is when Saving Private Ryan comes out. I didn't see it in the theaters. As I said, I was a freshman at Indiana University, and I had a girlfriend who lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and I went down to visit her. And she and stay with her family. I was meeting her family for the first time, and she and her mother had some event they had to go to, so they left me back with her dad. Right, so I'm sitting with my girlfriend.
It's bonding time.
Yeah, and the idea is, well, neither of you guys have seen this movie, so here's Saving Private Ryan. So that's I've probably met this guy the day before. I'm dating his daughter. And we watch a movie that opens with 20 solid minutes of 20-year-old men being slaughtered on a beach.
Right.
But that was rough. But it was an interesting experience. So I mean, personally, it has some significance. But going back, it is really this product of a moment in American history where it is very possible to see the United States as a force of, unimpeachable good in the world. It is possible to think about America as a power that is so significant and so influential that we don't need anybody else. We can do this all by ourselves. And this is very much a message of Saving Private Ryan, I think. And then, of course, the significance for filmmaking is huge. I mean, that 20-minute scene on Omaha Beach, I think, is just completely, it's a watershed moment in how war films are made. I think pretty much every big budget war film that comes after Saving Private Ryan is in some way inspired by that opening scene. And when we talk about the film, almost all the conversation is just about that scene, right? And it's the movie is it's what, 2 hours and 40 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
This is a 20-minute scene, and that's 95% of the conversations are about that scene. But the rest of the movie is what actually has has most of the political content. So and I think this is probably a good time to say my criticisms of the film are not really about that 20-minute scene, right? And that 20-minute scene is almost sacred to a lot of people, right? It comes out, it's so visceral, it's so evocative. Veterans see it, people that are actually there. It's triggering PTSD in some of these people. I mean, it's really just an incredible piece of film, but then the rest of the movie is totally different in tone and its political messages.
Yeah, it's really an inward thinking piece after that first 20 minutes of really shock and awe and frankly horror. Yeah. On that, as you're talking about that, there's a scene actually that this reminds me of in some ways, as far as its effect on things. It's actually the opening scene in Star Wars in 1977, because we've seen space movies before 1977. Science fiction's been out there, science fantasy, so forth, right? But to see the blockade runner followed by that seemingly endless Star Destroyer, you knew at that point in time you were in for something different. The audiences had never seen anything quite like that. And we'd seen war movies before. In fact, visceral war films. I'm thinking about things like Platoon and so forth, but nothing quite like where it just kept going. It was relentless. It's like the longest 20 minutes in film history. And I wonder, Paul, you talk about this idea about the film coming out in 1998 and this idea of envisioning America as this force for good. That was certainly not the case in the preceding 20 years of films, when largely the war films were coming out about Vietnam. The 80s, through pop culture, through war films were largely about lamenting that war and coming to terms with American involvement, what happens there, and so forth, right? I mean, it does seem to be a turning point. It's like, okay, does this movie not feel like it's a turning point past Vietnam in some ways, where we're gonna consciously talk about us as the good guys again? I mean,
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, and I think most of the Vietnam War films that we talk about now, that we remember, are essentially anti-war films,
oh, yeah.
right? They're films about how war is terrible and unnecessary. And Saving Private Ryan, that 20-minute scene, the Omaha Beach scene, is an anti-war scene, right? I mean, it opens up, and you're on the Higgins boats, right? The guys are throwing up, they're miserable. The ramp drops, and immediately the whole boat is slaughtered by German machine guns. I mean, this is an anti-war movie, right? As you start it, right, in that opening scene. The rest of the movie is not. Right. So it's really the scene that everybody talks about. The Omaha Beach scene is essentially an anti-war, at least in its tone. Right. It's taking the tone from these Vietnam War films. Right. War is brutal. It's not whether you live or die is really just a matter of chance. Right. None of these guys are doing anything wrong. They're not doing stupid. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and they're dying anyways. Right. It kind of breaks a lot of the sort of the moral rules that go in a lot of filmmaking. So in that sense, I think you can think of it as kind of an anti-war scene. But then the rest of the movie is, it pivots to a totally different tone, which I think is really interesting. And I think it makes it hard to talk about Saving Private Ryan in a critical way. Because, as I said, 95% of the conversation is about the Omaha Beach scene. But the Omaha Beach scene is totally different, and the message of the beach scene is totally different from the rest of the movie, right? So if you actually look at the opening of the movie, the opening scene is not Omaha Beach. It's that present day, or at least circa 1998, an old Matt Damon, walking through this cemetery, this American cemetery, and Normandy, with his family. It's an incredible. It's a gripping scene. It's very sentimental, and the opening and closing shots in the movie are an American flag, right? It's this sort of silent, the sun's rays streaming through an American flag, taking up the entire screen. Which that is a very political message, and it's not an anti-war message. Which I think is a really interesting dynamic, how they put those together.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit then about, let's talk about this. Let's go ahead and talk about this scene for a little bit more, because then I really do want to focus in on the remaining 2 hours and 20 minutes of this film, because this is a very inward focusing film, talking about the nature, about what does life matter, things like that. I want to ask you a contingency question though, Paul, because you've studied this war, you've taught this war, things like that. This D-Day happens late in the war, June 6th, 44. We've got a year left, a little less than a year left in Europe, right? We don't know this at the time. Can I ask you, what happens if D-Day fails? Like, this was a big gambit here that the Allies are planning here. What happens if all this goes wrong and all these boys fail in their mission?
So, this is counterfactual, and
right.
It's tough. But the first thing I would say is that it's not. And some of this is the effect of, cultural productions like Saving Private Ryan. It actually wasn't a huge gamble. It was a gamble. I mean, and, anytime you're talking about, thousands of people's lives, it's the moral weight and the moral significance is staggering. But, Allied planners were, pretty confident that this would succeed. And I think that a lot of the sort of popular characterizations of D-Day make it seem as if, it's kind of a 50-50 proposition. It really wasn't. It was, there had been years of planning and preparation that went into this. Particularly the Americans want to go in sooner. There's even talk of trying to do something like D-Days, in 1942. Which would probably have been impossible, but they make multiple promises to the Soviets that they're going to go in 43, and they don't. And the reason why they don't is because they're not confident that they're ready. The British leadership is pushing for a very different strategy that ultimately the Western Allies are going to follow to a large degree before D-Day. And essentially, what's happened in the intervening period is a few things, right? Number one, the Western Allies have secured air superiority over large stretches of Western Europe and the English Channel, which is critical, right? If you don't have that, you're not going to put tens of thousands of soldiers on these very vulnerable landing boats. They've secured naval supremacy throughout, pretty much the entire theater and the Atlantic Ocean itself. And critically, and this is something that is notably absent from films like Saving Private Ryan, the Soviet Union is, well on its way toward, just completely eradicating the Third Reich. Right. So, since what, early 43, the Soviets have essentially been pushing the Germans back. And so, is a very, very long time to get to a response to your question. I think if the D-Day landings had failed, what you would have seen is, it would have been catastrophic for the Americans and the British. It would have been bad for the Soviets because the Soviets would have had to, deal with more of the German, military machine. But ultimately, the Soviets were well on their way toward defeating Germany. So I think that there is a very good case to be made that what the D-Day landings actually do and what the success of Operation Overlord does is ensure that that Western armies will be in occupation of France and parts of Germany at the end of the war, rather than the Soviet Union, right? Because if the landings had failed, it's very likely that you would not have been able to have a situation where large contingents of Americans, British, and Canadian troops would have been able to be in Western Europe, and instead the Red Army would have gone in, which would have had massive implications for the post-45 world, but would not have been the event that guaranteed that Nazi Germany would survive. In fact, I think Nazi Germany's days were numbered, and had been for some time by the time that D-Day happens. So these popular depictions of D-Day as the event that secures German defeat, I think I think they're very misleading.
Can I ask you, we seem to understand, Germany, I don't know, does Germany know that they are on the verge of defeat in 44 as well? Are they aware? I mean, they're obviously retreating from their losses in the Soviet Union. Is Fury, the film with Brad Pitt, which we've actually talked about on this pod before, kind of addresses this about like they're just going to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. Is there a resignation, do you think, Paul, on the part of the Germans that know that, like, this is only a matter of time? Was there ever a point where they're like, whoa, maybe we should call this war off and sue for peace and just kind of go with what we got here? Or, I mean, what's the German position here heading on June 5th, 1944?
So there are a lot of different German positions. There are plenty of German generals that are basically saying exactly that, right? We can no longer win this war. We need to figure out some way to get out of it. The problem is that, in this totalitarian regime of, Nazi Germany, those voices don't necessarily matter all that much, at least at this point in the war. It's really just what Hitler wants and what Hitler is thinking. I think that the Germans recognize that they're losing the war. They recognize that, every week, every month that goes by, their situation is growing worse. But by the time that you get to mid 1944, the German leadership is very focused on what they see as potential rifts among the Allies. Right, so they know that the Americans and the Brits and the Soviets don't see eye to eye on everything. There's a lot of disagreement. And what they are hoping to do is somehow find a way to insert a wedge in the Grand Alliance and pry the Allies apart and figure out some means of surviving that way. And this is one of the big Allies' fears as well. In particular, and this is going back to your earlier question. One of the other things that theoretically could have happened had the D-Day invasion failed is the Soviet Union could have sued for peace on its own. Right, the Soviets could have said, "Look, we've recovered all of our former territory. We're the ones that have lost millions and millions of our citizens and soldiers, while the Americans and the British were fighting everywhere but Central Europe, and we're done. The Americans and the Brits can deal with Germany on their own." In retrospect, I think that's pretty far-fetched, given just the brutality of the war on the Eastern Front. I think it's unlikely that Stalin would have ever sought peace, after Stalingrad. But again, that's another counterfactual. But yeah, and I think there's a very clear sense among many Germans, the soldiers, the military leadership, and even a lot of the political leadership, that they're losing the war at this point. But they're not losing the war because of what. Or they're not losing the war because of what Britain and America are doing. They're losing the war because of what the Soviets are doing.
Can I ask you, I want to switch. The hard part about talking about this war is it at times feels, Paul, like two different wars, certainly the two major fronts here. What's going on in the Pacific at the same time? Is there also a sense that it's only a matter of time for the Japanese, or are they holding up? The whole time these boys are having to fight on Normandy, what's going on the beaches in the Pacific?
So that's kind of the amazing thing. And that's one of the remarkable things about what the United States actually is able to accomplish during the war. Because, D-Day is June 6, 1944. June 15th, right, which is, 9 days later, U.S. Marines land on Saipan, right, which is one of the biggest battles of the Pacific War. And this is less than 2 weeks apart that the United States is doing this. And, the United States really is fighting a global war on, separate sides of the world. This is happening June 5th, right? The day before the Allies take Rome, right? Which is an event of, unimaginable, significance in all sorts of ways. Rome, the ancient capital of the Roman Empire, Rome, the capital of Mussolini's Italy. They've knocked one of the three Axis powers out of the war. The commander of U.S. forces that leads U.S. forces into Rome and takes the city actually complains about this because the following day, right on the heels of taking Rome, this signature accomplishment, D-Day happens, and so he complains
he's not getting his cred.
Yeah, the newspapers just move on to D-Day. If you take a step back from the egos and the personal politics of all of this, it's just staggering that the United States is able to do this. Right? All of this is happening in the space of less than 2 weeks. In the summer of 1944, right? The United States is seizing, is completely, or not completely, knocking Italy out of the war. The war is going to continue there, but they seize Rome, they land in Saipan, and they land in Normandy. And it's the fact that the Western Allies are able to fight on all of these different fronts at the same time that is really the truly impressive work that they're doing, in contrast to the Soviet Union, which is basically is primarily just fighting on one front in the East. But that's the front where you have these massive battles, and you have the overwhelming majority of German forces in the East, not in the West, where D-Day is happening.
I want to move us off of the beach, if we will. From this war, and talk now about maybe the more complicated discussions going on about this film, and intertwine that with the discussions that you have with the readers inside this just marvelous book. Can we talk about some of the bigger picture things, that the other messages that Spielberg and the actors and the cast and all the people who make this film are trying to send to the viewers on this? So when people are going back to rewatch this film, what should they be aware of? What are the other conversations that are being had via this film?
So, I'd go back to this idea of, the 1990s as a particular moment in American history, right? And, I don't know if, Spielberg and Tom Hanks are thinking in these terms, but they're definitely a product of the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the times. Of this sort of unipolar moment, right? The Cold War is over. If we go back and we look at what the United States is doing in the 90s, the Somalia, right? The intervention in Somalia, the famous Black Hawk Down incident, that happens in 93. Rwanda happens in 94. And, there's the wars in the former Yugoslavia. The United States is about to intervene or the United States has intervened in Kosovo, right? And so this is a very particular moment in American history. Saving Private Ryan comes out in 1998. Thomas Friedman's Lexus and the Olive Tree comes out in 1999, right? And this is his big book, one of the main texts of like American-led globalization, right? The entire world just wants to live like Americans live. Everybody wants to eat at McDonald's. Everybody wants to drive a Lexus.
Paul, I'm wearing blue jeans right now.
Exactly. There, and there's this sense in the 90s that the United States is in this unique position to save the world, and that's what the world wants, right? That this is very much kind of in the water in the United States in the 1990s. Except you got the example of Somalia, right? The United States intervenes a little bit, and it goes bad, right? You've got the example of Rwanda. The United States does not intervene in the Rwandan genocide, and Clinton is criticized for that. Saving Private Ryan comes along, and this is a story about the United States intervening in a catastrophic war. It is the bloodiest war in human history, but it's that intervention that allows the United States to save the world, right? And jump ahead, we're in Kosovo, and all of this is sort of priming America for what's going to come in the 21st century in the post 9/11 world, with the sort of neoconservative movement and this push to essentially democratize the world, starting with the Middle East, right? And so we're just a few years away from invading Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think it's hard to say how much of that is being driven by films and texts like Saving Private Ryan, and how much is it that these films just reflect this larger idea. But this is why it's important to interrogate something like Saving Private Ryan, because it, as I said, it's a very Americentric view of the war, right? We're only talking about what the Americans are doing. The Omaha Beach scene is seen as sort of put forward as the pivotal event of the war, right? This is when America wins the war. And this is the same moment in the 1990s when the United States is gearing up to, embark in what become a disastrous series of wars in the 21st century. So I think that's really important to remember when we watch, that opening scene in the cemetery, right? And it's both the opening scene and the closing scene. Right. And Tom Hanks, his last words, right, with his dying breath, his words are "earn this," right, to Matt Damon's character. Right. And then, at the very end of the movie, we go back to the cemetery, and the elderly Matt Damon, turns to his wife and says, "Have I lived a good life?" And that's very much, it's a message about survivor's guilt. It's a message about the sacrifice that the United States paid in the Second World War, but it's also a message that says, we had to do this. This was necessary, and use this for something good, right? And that very much feeds into this notion of American power as a unilateral force for good in the world.
Yeah, I can't help but now think about the presidency of George W. Bush, right? Mm-hmm. And almost, his father, of course, was a World War II veteran, I believe shot down in the Pacific, if I recall correctly. His father riding the high of this coalition building during the first Gulf War. And following that, George W. Bush clearly sees the world in a very black or white, good versus evil. And I'm wondering if, films like this are building upon and maybe contributing to a global hawkishness on the part of the United States entering into 2000, 2001 and so forth, where we're recentering us as the good guys again. Look, and I'm so tired, Paul, of hearing, if it weren't for us, you'd all be speaking German. Now, we hear this, we continually hear this as part of the dialogue on the part of the right. To this day, I want to say Lauren Boebert, fellow Coloradan, is always talking about, I hear this all the time, and it annoys me to no end. And it's, again, talking about this. And man, I don't want to be the downer here, but we probably need to talk about the wartime atrocities as well, because you talk about this as well, right? This idea is like, hey, okay, when we talk about World War II, often things like the Holocaust, rape of Nanking are discussed, and rightfully so. But this is not a purely noble act on the part of Americans. We see this with, say, the death of Wade, when they let the Nazi soldier go. Later on, he kills him in cold blood. We see this another. Fury does this as well, where so forth. Can we talk about this as well? Because there's a lot of shades of gray within the part of the Allies and Allied actions as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Atrocity is a core part of warfare. Going back to ancient times. And I think it's a mistake when historians don't talk about this as oftentimes an integral part of a lot of these conflicts. But again, this is one of the ways that a film like Saving Private Ryan kind of distorts our the way that we understand the war, because what they're showing in Saving Private Ryan is the war in Western Europe. And the war in Western Europe, there certainly were atrocities, right? There were plenty of cases of POWs being murdered. The Germans were guilty of a lot of atrocities, but there's even cases of, the Western Allies engaging in atrocities. But the big atrocities were happening in every other theater of the war, right? And by framing the American understanding of World War II as something that was, primarily fought in Western Europe, it kind of glosses over this other story about what's happening on the much larger battlefields of the Eastern Front, right, where it is just a straightforward genocidal war, right? You're not talking about a dozen soldiers, who are taken POW and they're massacred. They're massacred. You're talking about millions. Right, millions of Soviet POWs are just put into essentially, rings of barbed wire and left to starve to death. Obviously, Germany is engaging in the Holocaust as an integral part of Hitler's vision of what the German Empire is supposed to be. And the Pacific War is just, saturated with atrocities, right? So and again, I don't want to sort of suggest that this was, Spielberg's intention with Saving Private Ryan, but the way that the war in Western Europe and D-Day and the way that these films narrow our focus to Western Europe gives us the opportunity to not pay as much attention to these other atrocities. The other dimension of this, and a lot of this work comes from a historian named Will Hitchcock, who wrote a really good book about civilian populations in Western Europe during World War II. Almost as many French civilians die on D-Day as Allied soldiers, right? And they do it as a result, and most of them are killed by Allied bombs. Right, because what the Allies are doing in preparation for the landings is just bombing the hell out of parts of coastal Normandy, and we know that the World War II era bombing was incredibly imprecise. Right, they're not trying to kill civilians, but they kill something like close to 4,000 civilians on D-Day, which is about the same number as of British, Canadian, and American soldiers that are killed. And this is not really something that films like Saving Private Ryan portray. So I wouldn't call accidental bombing by Western air forces an atrocity on par with like orchestrated murdering of POWs. But it definitely tells us something about the carnage of the war that is not really portrayed in a film like this.
The things I'm thinking about as well are, the fire bombings that occur. We've seen this. Dresden, of course, is we're going to talk about Western Europe, thinking about Dresden specifically, but then, of course, the firebombing of Japan is civilian. I think a lot of the attention for people who don't study the war gets drawn to the bomb. The numbers of deaths, civilian deaths, far exceed in Japan via the bombing of these cities than say the two atomic bombs. One of the things that Band of Brothers does, and I don't think you can really talk about this series or this show without talking about Band of Brothers. We actually did the most recent series of that here on the pod. But can we talk a little bit about Band of Brothers? Maybe is continuing this conversation.
Yeah, Band of Brothers and the Pacific too.
Yeah, I mean, what do those series do for us as well?
So I don't think they would have been possible without Saving Private Ryan, right? Because it's the same kind of production team. It's Spielberg and Tom Hanks that then go on, and they use a lot of the same kind of visual cues and like the filters and the
music.
The tone. But in my opinion, I think Band of Brothers and the Pacific are much, much better. They're more accurate. I think Band of Brothers is based on Stephen Ambrose's work on the 101st Airborne.
Yeah,
he does. He has a bunch of oral histories with them, and so it is a much more nuanced, much more accurate portrayal of the war that nevertheless borrows heavily from Saving Private Ryan in its sort of cinematography and the tone that it develops. Pacific is the same thing, except it's based on some of these really fantastic classic war memoirs. Like E.B. Sledge's With the Old Breed. And like Sledge is a key character in the Pacific. So I actually think they did a much better job with those two series. They're much more accurate. They give a much more nuanced picture of the war. Even though they still remain, fairly Americentric. But they're not as invested in this sort of myth making that goes into Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, I will tell you, I am guilty of a good Band of Brothers like marathon watch at least once a year. I'll just sit down and watch, and of course over the summer or whatever. And I'm from Western Kentucky, and I grew up in Murray, Kentucky, and Clarksville, Tennessee. So the 101st is right there in Fort Campbell. So it's always been part of our regional. That's our guys, if you will. So when I would see them on screen, it's like, okay, those are our boys.
I taught at the University of Kentucky for 6 years. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's I'm hiding my accent, Paul. I wonder, are there parts of this film that you also like that it's doing well?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the Omaha Beach scene is fantastic. It's not perfect. You can nitpick bits and pieces of it, but overall, I think it's really fantastic. Both as a representation of what combat was probably like, or at least according to the people that actually experienced it, and also as a significant event in filmmaking. I think it does a really good job of conveying, but the entire film does a good job of conveying the brutality of the war. It does a good job of, conveying the unfairness, right, of the war. It's none of these people really deserve to die. None of them are making the mistakes that you see victims in horror movies making. So it certainly doesn't. You don't leave with a sense that, wow, I want to go to war. War looks so cool and so fun, and I think that's important. And yeah, I just think in the minute to minute, I think it's very good, and it's often a very kind of faithful attempt to recreate what it would have looked like and some of the things that would have happened to people fighting in the war. It's just when you kind of put the entire story together that it starts to become more complicated and more fraught.
I want to ask you, I think it's the stories, we talked about this, you kind of alluded to it earlier about sometimes skipping over the wars so you can get to the Cold War or talk about these other conflicts and things like that. I know a lot of times students would come to me when I was teaching and things like that, like, I want to talk about the war in class. So, well, we have a specific class about the war and things like that, because the idea really for a lot of scholars is wars are agents of change and things like that. Certainly something you discuss here in the book. And I want to talk about this. I mean, the big transformations that actually happen as a result of this war on a global scale. We can get back to this idea of creating these other or resurrecting empires, how it sets up. You talk about teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict. Like, what does this war do on a global scale besides defeat the bad guys and things like that? What happens next? And how are we still living in the shadow of it, Paul? Because I feel like we can't get away from World War II.
I mean, I really think 1945 is kind of the starting point for the modern era of international relations. Going back to the discussion of empire and colonialism, I really think it's World War II that delivers the sort of the final death blow to the old colonial imperialism of the 19th century. I think there's a misconception that type of imperialism ends after World War I, or it starts to fall apart. I would argue actually that we see a kind of a fervent period of imperial expansion after World War I, right? The British and the French are moving into the former Ottoman Empire. It's really World War II that I think it reveals that the sort of colonial imperialism of the 19th century, the long 19th century, is no longer a really viable means of operating in the post 45 world, and it does that. It does that by the way that the Allies win the war, right? If you think about it, what the war, at least in Europe, begins with the fairly rapid defeat of France, right? Or I guess after the conquest of Poland, France collapses pretty quickly, and France is one of the great world powers in the interwar years, right? It's the second largest empire in the world after Great Britain, and the French just collapse before the Nazi onslaught. Britain, the largest empire in the world, is incapable of turning the tide on its own. It's only the United States and the Soviet Union, which are, I think it's fair to think of them as imperial powers, but they're not the sort of backward-looking 19th century imperial powers like Britain and France. They're sort of a new type of imperial power. After 45, we'll call them superpowers, right? But it's really the superpowers that are the key arbiters of global of the global order post 1945, which is a significant change from the world before that. The sort of old-fashioned colonial empire doesn't work anymore. The Americans don't really want a colonial empire, right? They have colonies, but they're in the process of kind of offloading them. What the Americans want is a different type of kind of quasi-imperial power that's going to be based on American economic might, that's based on the appeal of American culture, the appeal of consumer abundance, that's based on the appeal of sort of notions of democracy and liberalism, and this sort of ideological sense that that the United States and liberal democratic capitalism is the way to organize the world. And if everyone kind of joins into this this capitalist relationship with the United States, we will have a bright, sunny, abundant, prosperous future. The Soviet Union has its own vision, right? And it's a socialist vision, it's a revolutionary vision. But the Soviets are also sort of pushing their own ideology, and saying if everyone sort of creates the conditions either through revolution or fairly rapid political reform to create socialist states and joins this Soviet-led communist order, then we will live in a utopian future as well. And that's really that's really the spirit that emerges out of World War II post 45, and it contrasts pretty markedly with the sort of, as I said, the old-fashioned colonial imperialism, that is epitomized by empires like Britain and France. And so I think World War II renders that old-fashioned imperialism obsolete.
One of the things I would talk to my students about when I was teaching was the idea, love it or hate it, the idea of, say, make America great again was always this fascinating conversation starting piece, because it allowed me to have all of these amazing questions I could jump from, right? Was America ever great to begin with? If so, when was it? Why was it? Can it be again? So forth. And what I've continually found, I don't know if this has been your experience, was like when typically people point to make America great again, they're often referring to America being great as this immediate post-war era from, say, 45 to 60. And so forth. And I'm wondering, do you see this as well? Is there do you notice like a nostalgia on the part of like a post-war United States where we are? I mean, quite literally, the economy was the only functioning manufacturing center in the world at that point in time. I mean, correct? I mean, the rest of the world had been bombed to hell and back.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a big part of the story of American post-war supremacy, right? The United States is powerful not only because it built itself into a superpower in order to defeat the Axis, but also because the rest of the world has been decimated. And there is a way to tell the story of the Cold War as kind of ironically as a long campaign by the United States to rebuild Japan and Germany as the economic centers of East Asia and Europe, which is successful. And the irony here is that that's what the Germans and the Japanese wanted by fighting the war, right? The Japanese wanted to be the preeminent economic, and political power in East Asia. And there was a period, during the Cold War where the United States helped build them into that. Germany.
All you had to do was ask.
well, all they had to do is do it under the sort of American concept of what a socio-political order should look like, which is not what the Germans or not what the Nazis and Imperial Japan was doing. That's definitely a dynamic.
You've been teaching this war, the Cold War, things like that for a while. Are there other films that you really like that also translate into good conversation pieces about what the war is or what it does and so forth?
Not really. I don't usually work with a lot of film in my class, and I think World War II films are challenging too, because there is such a temptation to tell the story of World War II in this sort of heroic framework. And so it can be hard to do that. I think that it's probably more useful to use like Vietnam War films that are able to take a much more sort of critical position toward the story. And this goes back to part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, because I wanted to be able to have a more interesting conversation about World War II with my students, and to give them material that was not just stuck in this sort of 1950s version of good versus evil. The war is a crusade against fascism and totalitarianism, and the democracies win. By the way, let's not talk about the Soviet Union and the central role that it played. And that's a very, when you start to dig into the sort of orthodox or conventional narrative, it becomes very problematic. And so, I was trying to kind of push back against that.
Process of writing a book. I'm in the process of writing my very first book off my dissertation, which is, this love-hate relationship I'm having right now with my own work. But I'm wondering, as you wrote this book, were there parts of this book that you like that didn't make it into the book? Were there stories here that you were like, gosh, I wish I had time to put into this thing? Were there other pieces or things that you're going, you know what, this is better suited for another piece later on? Or has this like allowed you to like think about this, writing this book allowed you to think about what comes next for you as a scholar? Because I love what you're doing here, writing for everybody who wants to come to understand this war in a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, there were. I had a very long section. I had very long sections on actually the late 19th century and early 20th century imperialism. And so I had basically a whole chapter on what Imperial Germany was doing in Southwest Africa at the beginning of the 20th century. And they essentially launching a genocide against the Herero people in what is modern day Namibia, and sort of I talk about the Boer War as this is the first instance of concentration camps, and the British are operating them, and they're putting essentially Dutch or ethnically Dutch farmers in concentration camps in the South Africa colony. So that there are stories there that kind of emerge in the early 20th century or late 19th century. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. It's I've had a tendency to kind of work backwards in time. My first book was about the 1960s and 1970s. My second book was about the Cold War. And, after writing the book about the Cold War, I realized, I really should be talking about World War II. So there is a general tendency in my research to just keep going back in time.
If we're putting it in mood terms, perhaps you are committed to prequels at this point.
Yeah.
So, all right, Paul, let me ask you our big last question here. Is Saving Private Ryan a history movie?
I think Saving Private Ryan is an excellent. It is a history movie, but it is a history movie that is as much about the 1990s as it is about Operation Overlord.
Yeah. I'm really glad you said that, because you really do spell that out, and you've done that for us over the last hour. And I hope that when people listen to this pod, they've come to get that, and also look for what comes next in your book. So, man, I really appreciate you taking time today. It's a lot of fun talking about a really consequential film. And dude, this book is so cool. I love it. It's going immediately right here on the shelf back here. I just loved it. So, man, thank you so much.
Thanks. Very kind of you to say. Thanks. And Saving Private Ryan is a good film. Watch the Omaha Beach scene. The rest of it, if you feel like it. But yeah.
Young man, if you're courting women, bring a copy of this. Have it streaming on Amazon, ready to meet dad, and be like, hey, I've got 20 minutes. Let's get to know each other. So just do that. And that's a wrap here at Historians at the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Paul Thomas Chamberlin, for coming in and talking to us about this film and his brand new book, Scorched Earth, A Global History of World War II. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this podcast happen, making this possible. And more than anything else, thank you to all of you for continuing to be a part of this community that we've built. Thank you so much for being here and being part of HATM. This was really a blast. We've got a bunch more pods coming for you soon. It's going to be a great summer for HATM, great summer for podcasts. So I hope you will subscribe to this pod, share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, and share it with everybody else. And we will catch you next time. Ciao for now. Bye.